In the early 16th century, the world was already divided, at least on paper. Spain and Portugal had not merely stumbled into overseas expansion, they had formalized it. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas drew an imaginary line down the Atlantic and declared that everything east of it belonged to Portugal and everything west to Spain. The treaty did not reflect geography very well, but it reflected power, and for decades it worked. Portugal took the long eastern road, down the coast of Africa and across the Indian Ocean, building a chain of fortified ports that funneled spices, silk, and profit back to Lisbon. Spain, by contrast, had found land rather than a route. The Americas were vast, rich, and confusing, but they were not Asia. By the 1510s, this imbalance mattered. Spices were not culinary indulgences, they were preservatives, medicines, and symbols of status, and the margins were enormous. Portugal's control of the eastern route gave it leverage Spain could not match. Spain needed a way into the same system without violating the treaty outright. That constraint shaped everything that followed. This is where Ferdinand Magellan enters the story. Magellan had spent years in Portuguese service in the Indian Ocean world. He had seen the spice trade firsthand, fought in it, and come away convinced of two things. First, that the maps Europeans were using radically underestimated the size of the globe, and second, that the Spice Islands might fall on Spain's side of the treaty line if approached from the west. He believed, or at least argued convincingly, that there had to be a passage through the southern reaches of the American continent, a strait that would open onto another ocean entirely. Portugal rejected the idea. The eastern route already worked, and Magellan was not politically indispensable. Spain, however, was in a different position. King Charles I inherited a sprawling but uneven empire and was open to bold solutions that promised parity with Portugal. Magellan's proposal offered exactly that. No treaty violation, no war, just a geographical argument carried out with ships. The approval of the expedition was not an endorsement of certainty, it was an endorsement of plausibility. The maps were suggestive. Other navigators believed such a passage might exist. The costs, while high, were finite. If it worked, Spain would gain direct access to Asian trade. If it failed, the loss could be absorbed. On paper, it was a rational gamble. 5 ships were commissioned in 1519 and placed under Magellan's command. That decision carried its own tensions. A Portuguese captain would lead a Spanish fleet into waters no European had measured, following assumptions no one could verify. These were the initial conditions: a divided world, an economic bottleneck, imperfect maps, and a leader whose idea was just credible enough to be funded and just uncertain enough to test every structure holding the expedition together. Seville in 1519 smelled of river mud, citrus peel, and rope tar, and the Guadalquivir carried all of it past warehouses stacked with barrels and folded canvas. The port was Spain's choke point to the Atlantic, and the expedition had to be born inside its bureaucracy. Contracts were written in careful language because the ocean was not careful. Magellan had secured a royal agreement that offered him a share of profits and titles in lands not yet found, but paper did not load ships, and paper did not quiet men who felt insulted. The fleet itself was an argument in wood. 5 vessels of different size and temperament, all of them small by later standards, all of them forced into a role that demanded too much. The flagship, the Trinidad, carried Magellan and the weight of decision. The San Antonio was the largest and therefore the most confident of its own importance. The Concepcion and the Victoria were workhorses. The Santiago was a smaller scout, built for shore work and risky probing. Men were pulled in from everywhere, Basque sailors, Andalusians, Portuguese pilots, Italians looking for opportunity, a few men pressed into service by need rather than ambition. Some knew the sea, some only knew that a berth meant wages. Among the people closest to Magellan was Enrique, an enslaved man from Southeast Asia who could speak languages from the trading world they hoped to reach. His presence was practical and revealing. Spain called the mission a voyage. Portugal called it a provocation. For the men on deck, it was a floating bargain. Hunger, danger, and discipline in exchange for a chance at profit and status. Magellan's authority came from the crown, but suspicion came from the gangways. Spain had given him the command, and then, to keep him contained, had attached Spanish officers whose job was to watch him. One of them, Juan de Cartagena, carried royal standing and expected deference. Cartagena was not a sailor of Magellan's school, but he had the kind of power that does not need to know how to tie knots. Magellan, for his part, was not a man built for sharing control. He kept his route close, his charts closer, and his decisions wrapped in the kind of silence that makes other men feel tricked. All of this happened while Portugal watched from the other side of the treaty line. Lisbon understood the threat immediately. A Spanish fleet reaching the Spice Islands by sailing west would not only siphon profit, it would challenge the entire legal geometry of empire. Portuguese agents followed Magellan's preparations. Warnings reached Seville. There were rumors of sabotage. Men vanished from taverns and returned with strange offers. Even before the fleet left Spain, it was already being chased. On August 10th, 1519, the ships eased away from Seville and drifted downriver, crowded with barrels of wine and biscuit, coils of rope, spare spars, sacks of beans, iron tools, and the countless minor items that keep men alive only if everything else goes right. It was a slow departure, almost domestic, as if the river wanted to pretend that the Atlantic did not exist. Weeks later, at Sanlúcar de Barrameda, where the river meets the sea, the fleet waited for weather and last-minute supplies, and the waiting did what waiting always does. It sharpened irritation and gave men time to whisper. Magellan's problem was not only the ocean, it was the small society trapped on those decks. Every day at anchor was a day for Cartagena, and others to remind crews that their captain general was Portuguese. Every order Magellan gave became a referendum on whether Spain had sold its own pride for a gamble. When the fleet finally pushed into the Atlantic in September, the coastline fell away and Spain became an idea behind them. A voyage like this begins with ordinary motion, sails filling, water hissing along planks. But the stakes change faster than the horizon. Once the last familiar headlands disappeared, the treaty line and the royal contract did not feel like protections anymore. They felt like a dare. The first leg down to the Canary Islands was meant to be routine, and that made it revealing. Magellan chose his course and kept his counsel tight. Cartagena challenged him in ways that sounded procedural, but were really about control. Who gave orders, who received reports, who owned the knowledge that would decide life and death. Magellan responded as he would respond again and again, by tightening, not loosening. He reminded Cartagena that the crown had given him command. He used arrests and demotions early, before the ocean could force his hand. Some captains saw discipline, others saw fear. By the time the fleet crossed into warmer waters toward Brazil, the ships were already running 2 voyages at once. Above deck, there was the official mission: find the passage, cross the unknown ocean, reach the Spice Islands, return with proof that Spain could crack Portugal's monopoly. Below deck, in the dim spaces where men slept beside casks and rats, there was the unofficial mission: decide whether Magellan was leading them toward profit or toward a graveyard. In December 1519, the coast of Brazil came into view, green and steaming, the shoreline thick with trees that looked like a wall. The fleet anchored near what the Portuguese called Rio de Janeiro, and for a moment the expedition could pretend it was only a long merchant run. Water could be gathered, repairs could be made, men could go ashore and feel soil under their feet. The world was still generous. But Magellan did not linger. Every day in territory claimed by Portugal increased the risk of interception. Portugal did not need to declare war to ruin the mission. It only had to catch it. The fleet moved south again, following the ragged outline of South America, looking for the place where the continent would stop blocking the way. Maps of the period did not show empty space the way modern maps do. They filled unknown areas with hopeful geometry and decorative certainty. On paper, a strait could be penciled in where a coastline became inconvenient. On the water, a strait had to be earned by cold searches and wrong turns. In January and February 1520, the fleet probed the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, a wide estuary that seemed for a moment like the promised opening. The water was fresh enough to hint at a river system, and that detail mattered. A strait to another ocean would have salt. A river mouth would not. Magellan tested, waited, listened to the water and the current, and then made the decision that would define the voyage. It was not the passage. The fleet turned away and went farther south. Every degree of latitude peeled away a layer of comfort. Nights grew sharper. The sea became heavier, a darker metal. The wind carried a warning. By March, the fleet reached Patagonia, a coastline of bleak openness, where the land looked unfinished and the sky did not care who had royal permission to be there. At Puerto San Julian, a natural harbor in what is now southern Argentina, Magellan ordered the fleet to winter. It was a practical decision. Storm season made exploration suicidal, but it sounded like a sentence. The men had not signed up to freeze at the edge of a world they did not understand, eating through provisions while the passage remained imaginary. Wintering also meant staying still, and staying still meant politics. The mutiny did not erupt out of nowhere. It developed the way rot develops, in darkness and repetition. Captains resented Magellan's severity. Crews resented hunger and cold. Cartagena and others resented being commanded by a foreigner who treated them like subordinates rather than partners. The breaking point came around Easter 1520, when Catholic ritual sharpened moral claims. While the fleet lay trapped in cold wind and uncertainty, 3 of the ships, San Antonio, Concepcion, and Victoria, rose against Magellan. It was not a riot, it was an attempted coup, led by officers who knew exactly how fragile authority becomes when distance removes oversight. The mutineers' logic was simple. The expedition had already failed its promise. The passage was not found. Supplies were being consumed. Men were dying. Returning while they still could was not cowardice. It was survival. They demanded control of the fleet and a return to Spain. Magellan's response showed the kind of leader he was, not charismatic, not conciliatory, but decisive in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. He did not negotiate on their terms. He used the one advantage he still had, surprise and loyal men, and he took back the ships with force. On the Victoria, Luis de Mendoza was killed in the struggle, stabbed and thrown down. Gaspar de Quesada, another leader, was tried and executed. Cartagena, because of his royal connections, received a punishment that was both merciful and brutal. He was put ashore and left behind, marooned in the cold emptiness of Patagonia with a priest who had joined the rebellion. Magellan could not risk bringing him home as a living accusation, and he could not risk executing him as a political martyr. The coast solved the problem quietly. By the time the mutiny was crushed, the fleet was smaller in spirit even before it was smaller in number. Magellan had proven that he would enforce authority at any cost. He had also proven, to some, that he could be trusted only in the narrow sense that a knife can be trusted. It will do what it is made to do. Winter dragged on. The wind kept the water rough. Ice formed on rigging. Men looked at their hands and saw cracking skin. Food became a calculation rather than a meal. Magellan sent scouting parties inland and along the shore. Encounters with local people, tall, wary, and entirely unimpressed by European titles, became part of the expedition's mythology later, but at the time they were simply another reminder. Spain's lines on maps meant nothing here. When spring finally loosened its grip, Magellan resumed the search. The Santiago, the small scout ship, was sent ahead along the coast to probe inlets and look for openings. The decision was sensible, but the coast punished it. In a storm, the Santiago was wrecked. Men survived by scrambling ashore, and the loss was a warning written in splintered wood. The land would take ships as easily as it took pride. Still, Magellan pressed south. At this point, the expedition had already paid a price: mutiny, executions, a wreck, and it had not yet found its reason. That imbalance is what makes people break. If a voyage costs too much before it offers proof, every man starts to do his own accounting. In October 1520, the coastline changed. The water at the edge of the continent became more complicated, cut with channels and islands. What had been a blunt landmass began to fray. Magellan anchored near a wide opening and sent boats to sound the depths and test currents. The tide moved differently here. The water carried the taste of ocean rather than river. The land did not look like a bay. It looked like a wound. This was the moment Magellan had sold to Spain, the possibility that the continent could be slipped past, not conquered. The entrance was not a triumphal gateway. It was cold and narrow and uncertain, but it was real. Magellan named the place the Strait of All Saints because it was found near All Saints' Day. The name did not stick. Names are chosen later by people who want simplicity. What mattered then was navigation through a maze of channels where fog could erase landmarks and tides could pin ships against rocks. The fleet entered the strait in late October. It was an act of commitment because once the ships were inside, turning back meant fighting currents and admitting that the passage led nowhere. Magellan moved carefully, anchoring often, sending boats ahead, reading the coastline like a text written in stone. The stress inside the strait was not only geographic, it was social. The San Antonio, the largest ship, carried a swelling resentment. Its officers argued that the passage was a trap. They feared Magellan's stubbornness more than the unknown sea ahead. In November, the San Antonio deserted. It turned back through the strait and fled for Spain, taking with it a huge share of provisions and tools. Desertion is not just a loss of manpower, it is an act of narrative sabotage. If the San Antonio reached Spain first, it could tell the story as it pleased. Magellan as tyrant, the voyage as madness, the expedition as a crime against common sense. Magellan could not chase it without abandoning the passage itself. He had to accept the theft and keep moving. 3 ships emerged from the strait into an ocean Europeans did not yet understand. Magellan looked out across calm water and called it the Pacific. The word sounds like a blessing. It was a mistake in tone, if not in observation. The sea was calm at first. The distance was not. The maps that supported Magellan's promise had shrunk the planet. They made the world feel manageable. The Pacific was the punishment for that illusion. The crossing from the strait to the islands of Asia was not a long sail. It was an endurance trial that ate men from the inside. The ships pushed into open ocean in November 1520, sailing northwest, hunting for land that did not appear. Days stretched into weeks, weeks stretched into months. The calm that had inspired Magellan's name for the sea became its own cruelty, because light winds meant slow progress, and slow progress meant provisions disappearing at a steady, unstoppable pace. Food degraded first: biscuit, hard bread baked for storage, filled with worms. The men ate it anyway. Water turned sour in casks. The ships carried salted meat and dried legumes, but storage never lasts as long as planners hope. Rats became a source of protein, sold and traded as if they were delicacies. Leather that covered rigging was softened in seawater and chewed. Scurvy arrived quietly. It always does. At first it is fatigue, then gum disease, then wounds that will not close, then teeth loosening, then a smell in the mouth that hints at decay. Men who had survived storms and mutiny began to die because their bodies ran out of something they could not name. The sea did not have to smash them, it only had to deny them. Magellan kept the ships moving because stopping was not an option. There was no place to stop. He rationed, he enforced discipline, he pushed forward with the kind of resolve that looks like greatness from a distance and feels like oppression up close. A leader can be right about the course and still wrong about what the course will do to the people forced to follow it. In March 1521, after nearly 4 months across the Pacific, the expedition reached the Mariana Islands. Land appeared as green relief, a shape on the horizon that turned men into believers again. Canoes approached, swift and confident, and the first contact was not gentle. Islanders came alongside and took items from the ships, small goods, tools, anything not nailed down, and sailed away with the ease of people who had lived on water their entire lives. Magellan's men interpreted this as theft and named the islands accordingly. The response was violence. Punitive raids, burning houses, killing, and intimidation meant to reassert control. The episode showed the expedition's condition. These were not fresh emissaries of a confident empire. These were starving men who reacted to loss the way desperate men do. From the Marianas, Magellan sailed on toward the archipelago that would later be called the Philippines. The ships reached Samar, and then a small island where they could anchor and recover. The land here was part of the trading world Magellan knew. Networks of tribute and exchange, local rulers balancing alliances, commerce carried in boats that moved faster than European assumptions. Magellan did not arrive as a visitor. He arrived as a man still executing a plan. The plan had shifted in tone. The mission to reach the Spice Islands remained, but Magellan had also become an agent of empire in the broader sense. He carried a priest. He carried symbols of royal authority. He had the instinct, common to European commanders of the period, that diplomacy and conversion could serve as tools of control. On the island of Cebu, Magellan met Raja Humabon, a local ruler who understood that an alliance with armed foreigners could be useful. In the space of a few days, a relationship formed that both men believed they could manage. Humabon offered supplies, trade, and political recognition. Magellan offered military support and the prestige of connection to a distant king. Conversion followed, staged as both spiritual act and political theater. Humabon and others were baptized. A cross was raised. The Europeans interpreted this as submission. Local politics interpreted it as alliance. Both sides believed they had improved their position. Both sides were wrong about how quickly that belief could turn deadly. Magellan, having survived mutiny and ocean, now faced a more subtle danger. being drawn into conflicts that were not his. Local rivalries did not pause because foreign ships arrived. They sharpened. Humabon had enemies. One of them, a leader on the island of Mactan named Lapu-Lapu, refused to recognize Cebu's authority and refused to bend to Magellan's demands. Magellan could have treated the refusal as an inconvenience and moved on. The Spice Islands were still ahead. The expedition was still fragile. His ships were still undermanned. Any unnecessary fight was foolish. Instead, Magellan chose to make an example. The decision was not only tactical, it was psychological. After surviving so much, after proving the passage existed, after carrying men across an ocean that seemed designed to erase them, he could not tolerate a local chieftain saying no. Authority, once enforced by executions in Patagonia, demanded to be enforced again on a tropical shoreline. In April 1521, before dawn, Magellan led a small force to Mactan. The plan was simple: land, intimidate, burn, compel submission. The reality was mud, reef, and numbers. European ships could not approach close because of shallow water. Men had to wade through surf, carrying armor and weapons that became heavy and awkward. The defenders on Mactan did not meet them as passive villagers. They met them as fighters defending their ground, using the beach as a weapon. Magellan's men fired crossbows and arquebuses, but reloading was slow, and aim was compromised by water and motion. The defenders hurled spears and stones. They moved quickly, encircling, striking, retreating, striking again. The Europeans, burdened and few, could not impose the kind of formation warfare that made them dangerous elsewhere. Magellan, visible in armor, became the center of the fight. Leadership in that moment was not an abstraction. It was a man standing where others could see him. The defenders focused on him. A spear struck his leg. Another blow followed. He fell in shallow water, surrounded by men who understood that killing the leader would unmake the invaders' confidence. The battle ended not with a heroic last stand, but with the cold arithmetic of survival. The Europeans withdrew, pulling back toward their boats. Magellan did not come with them. His body was not recovered. In a few violent minutes, the expedition lost the man whose stubborn certainty had carried it past the continent and across the ocean. For the fleet, the death created an immediate crisis that no treaty line or royal contract could solve. Magellan had been the mission's spine. Whatever people thought of him, he had been the organizing force. With him gone, the expedition became a ship without a single mind. The surviving officers tried to hold the structure together, but the structure had already been weakened by every earlier fracture. Men argued over leadership. Some wanted to cut losses and return. Some wanted to press on, because returning meant recrossing the Pacific or risking Portugal's eastern net. The fleet was still far from home, and the options were narrowing. On Cebu, the alliance with Humabon turned poisonous. Humabon had watched Magellan die. He had learned instantly that these foreigners were not invincible. Their value as allies shifted, their threat shifted. There were accounts of a feast where Europeans were invited and then attacked, a sudden massacre that removed more officers and deepened chaos. Whether every detail of that ambush is clear or not, the outcome is the expedition lost more men and more coherence on the very ground where it had hoped to stabilize. With crews depleted, 3 ships were too many. The Concepcion was burned, reduced to ash and smoke, because there were not enough sailors left to sail it. That kind of decision feels unthinkable at the start of a voyage, when ships are symbols and investments. Later they become burdens. The ocean teaches ruthless simplification. 2 ships remained, the Trinidad and the Victoria. They moved south and west through island channels, seeking what Magellan had always promised Spain, access to the Spice Islands. Navigation here was less about empty ocean and more about threading through a crowded world of reefs, trade routes, and political calculations. Local pilots mattered. Fresh food mattered. Diplomacy mattered. The fleet reached the Moluccas later in 1521. This was the place Europeans had been chasing, islands where cloves grew and where sacks of dried spice could be worth fortunes in Europe. The sight of those cargoes must have felt like validation, not moral vindication, but proof that the gamble had touched something real. The ships loaded cloves until their holds were heavy and the decks smelled sharp and sweet. Men who had chewed leather on the Pacific could now touch the object that had justified everything. But even here, success was fragile. Portugal's network in the region was not a rumor. It was present. Portuguese ships and forts and alliances were part of the landscape. The Spanish fleet had to act like a thief, carrying gold through a city owned by someone else. Then the fleet faced its final decision, the one Magellan had never had to make because he was dead. How to go home? The Trinidad, Magellan's flagship, was in poor condition. Repairs were needed, and while repairs were attempted, the ship began to leak badly. The officers decided to split their fates. The Trinidad would try to return east across the Pacific, back the way they had come, aiming for Spanish America. The Victoria, smaller but in better shape, would attempt the western return, continuing around the world through the Indian Ocean and around the Cape of Good Hope, straight into Portuguese waters. It was a division of risk rather than of strategy. Both routes were nightmares. The Pacific crossing eastward was still an open question. No one knew if the winds and currents would allow it. The western route meant facing Portugal's ships and the long starvation of the Indian Ocean. The Trinidad tried the Pacific. It failed. Storms and broken rigging forced it back toward the Moluccas, where Portuguese forces eventually captured it. Many of its crew died in imprisonment or never returned to Spain. The flagship's end was quiet compared to its beginning. It vanished into the machinery of rival empire. The Victoria left with its hold full of cloves and its crew exhausted, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, a Basque sailor whose earlier life included debt and trouble, serious enough that he had reason to gamble on dangerous voyages. Elcano was not the visionary of the expedition. He did not sell Spain a new geography. He inherited a broken mission and had to complete it with discipline and nerve. From the Moluccas, the Victoria crossed into the Indian Ocean. The ship avoided major ports because major ports belonged to Portugal. It sailed with caution and with hunger. Supplies ran down again. Men began dying again. The spice cargo was valuable, but spices do not keep men alive on an empty stomach. Around the Cape of Good Hope, the Victoria met rough seas and punishing winds. The ship was overloaded and undermanned. Any major damage could have ended everything. Disease and malnutrition hollowed the crew. The voyage became a brutal negotiation between speed and survival. Sail fast enough to avoid Portuguese patrols, but not so fast that rigging fails and the ship breaks. At the Cape Verde Islands, territory controlled by Portugal, the Victoria took a desperate risk. It stopped to seek provisions, pretending it had come from the Americas, and did not realize it was in Portuguese waters. The lie worked briefly. Food was obtained. Then the truth surfaced, as truths do, through small inconsistencies. Portuguese authorities arrested some of the men who went ashore. The Victoria cut its ropes and fled, leaving those men behind. In September 1522, the Victoria reached Sanlúcar de Barrameda, the same mouth of river where the fleet had once waited with 5 ships and optimism. Now there was one ship, ragged and stained, and a handful of survivors. 18 men stepped onto Spanish soil. They were thin enough to look like different people. They carried candles to churches and offered thanks in the way men do when they are alive, in spite of their own expectations. In their wake, the ship's hold carried cloves, proof of the commercial purpose, and proof that a single voyage could, by accident and endurance, turn the globe into a loop. It was only after they returned that a strange detail emerged, the kind of detail that makes the world feel subtly less stable. The sailors discovered they were a day behind the calendar kept in Spain. They had recorded Sundays and fasts and saints' days as they moved westward, always keeping the rhythm of their own shipboard time. But by circling the world, they had crossed all longitudes without ever acknowledging the need to adjust by a day. The planet had collected its due. The expedition had not only traveled through space, it had exposed the way time is tied to geography. Spain took the cargo, counted the profit, counted the dead, and began the more permanent work, shaping the story. The temptation was to call it a triumph and stop there. A European fleet had found a passage at the bottom of the Americas. A European ship had returned from the west, proving by its own battered existence that the world could be circled. Those facts were real. They also hid the violence that made them possible and the accidents that kept them from collapsing completely. Magellan's name rose in the telling for reasons that are both fair and incomplete. He had conceived the route persuasively enough to win funding. He had found the strait that made the passage physically possible. He had enforced discipline through mutiny and wreck. Without his decisions, the expedition likely would have turned back before it ever touched the Pacific. But Magellan did not bring the ship home. He did not walk back into Seville with a hold of cloves. He did not face the accountants. He did not confront the calendar and the missing day. He died on a beach in the Philippines in a fight he chose when he could have sailed away. The man who completed the circumnavigation was Elcano, steering a single surviving ship through the last gauntlet of hunger, weather, and Portuguese patrols. The completion was not a matter of vision. It was a matter of endurance and judgment under collapse. That kind of achievement is harder to summarize in a single heroic portrait. History prefers a clean protagonist. It likes a name that can be attached to a strait and printed on a map. It likes the illusion that a voyage is the product of one mind rather than a chain of decisions made under pressure by many hands. Magellan's name fit the narrative machinery even when the full circle did not include his footsteps. The voyage is remembered as the first trip around the world, and in a sense it was. In another sense, it was a convoy of men escaping their own plan, surviving it, and returning with proof that the planet is larger than ambition, but smaller than certainty. A ship came back. A day was missing. A fortune lay in the hold, and the man most people remember never made it to the finish line that made him famous.